Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and today we're going to discuss the sad story of segregated America. This is going to involve the dreams of Abraham Lincoln, the ideals of the founding fathers, the ruination of the South, the corruption of a president, the power of the Bourbon Democrats, and the rise of Jim Crow. Now, we're going to follow that outline right there, right up above my little yellow box. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we discuss civil rights in America, or more accurately, the lack thereof. And our story here is not going to start at the beginning, but actually towards the end. Our story here is going to start on July 2nd, 1964, when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed one of the most influential pieces of legislation in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this was followed the very next year by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Standing over LBJ's shoulder was someone with no official political power at all. There he is, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And after he signed it, the president reached over his shoulder and shook the hand of Martin Luther King. And these two acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were a culmination of a decade of King's efforts. And these efforts were designed to dispel racial segregation in the United States and abolish a set of laws across the South known as Jim Crow. Now, specifically, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended racial discrimination based on race, color, sex, national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended such discrimination in voting rights, and that voting cannot be denied to anyone on the basis of racial discrimination. This truly was a historic rights bill that was signed by the president. It was an acknowledgement that the power of the federal government would be used to enforce the natural rights of all Americans, to enforce the provisions of the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Changes made to the Constitution itself in the days after the American Civil War. But the thing is, those amendments had largely been ignored for more than 100 years. And these two laws, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, were the culmination of a struggle that had been going on for nearly 70 years, the Civil Rights Movement, the fight against the racial discrimination of Jim Crow, and for the civil rights of African Americans that had been promised to them in the years following the Civil War. Now, this struggle culminated in the decade after World War II, specifically in the years between 1954 and 1965, between Brown versus the Board of Education and the two acts of 1964 and 1965. Now, during this period, the civil rights movement coalesced around the philosophy and leadership of an Alabama pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, King is so influential that this entire period, 1954 to 1965, has been termed the King years. Yet there were three generations of civil rights leaders and activists that preceded Dr. King, going all the way back to the Civil War itself, including that guy on the left, PBS Pinchback. There is Ida B. Wells. Right up above me, that's Walter White. And these guys are just a few of many, many people who fought against Jim Crow and against racial segregation. Each of these people added their voice to the fight for African Americans to have the civil rights they were entitled to and that had been promised to them after the Civil War. But two of these early activists stand head and shoulders above all others. And we're really going to focus on these two individuals, W.E.B. Du Bois there on the left, and right up above me, Booker T. Washington. These two men were giants of the early civil rights movement, and their disagreements would shape the civil rights movement well into the 20th century. Yet during the King years, Martin Luther King succeeded where all of these earlier generations of civil rights leaders, frankly did not. The two acts of 1964 and 1965, they could have been passed earlier. There's no reason that they had to wait, no legal reason that they had to wait until like the 60s. They could have been the Civil Rights Act of 1934 and 1935, or 1904, 1905, 1884, 1885. there is no legal reason that the United States had to wait 70 years to actually enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. I mean, after all these laws did was enforce amendments to the Constitution that had been passed back, around 1870. So the ultimate question that I want you to think about is, why? Why did the country wait so long? Why did Martin Luther King succeed when others had not? And this is the big question that you're going to build an answer to, over the next week or so. And this is the question right there. Why did Martin Luther King Jr. succeed when others did not? Okay, what exactly was Jim Crow? What were the earlier strategies that fought it? Were King's tactics substantially different? How was the nation substantially different? Was King just the collective culmination of the long decades of the civil rights struggle? Why did King change the country in a way that previous civil rights leaders did not? So put that question in your notes and cogitate on it as we move through this material. And, it's Martin Luther King really was one of the most influential Americans in history. And it's even more remarkable because he wasn't a president. He wasn't a senator. He never commanded armies in the field. He never ran for elected office. He was, at its very basic, just a pastor from Alabama. Yet he had such an incredible influence on American history that he changed the course of the entire country. And he's right up there with Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson, all of these individuals, who fundamentally shaped the American character. And Martin Luther King is absolutely one of these individuals, because it is Martin Luther King that actually made the country live up to its promises, the promises that it had made after the Civil War, and the promises that were embedded in the fundamental ideals of the United States itself. Okay, so why does this matter? All right. Why are we going to spend a week or so discussing, the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and all this stuff? Basically, it comes down to this. The civil rights movement, the civil rights struggle matters for three reasons. One, it represents the fulfillments of the dreams of Abraham Lincoln and the final fulfillment of the promises made to African Americans during Reconstruction. Now, we'll explore this shortly, but basically, after the Civil War, the federal government made certain specific promises about civil rights to the newly freed American slaves. Very few of these promises were kept in the very messy period that followed the Civil War. Secondly, it deals with the ideals of the founding fathers themselves. Now, the founding fathers, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, these guys established the principal role of the American government. And the principal role of the American government is to defend the natural rights of all citizens. That's why the government exists. The founding fathers said, we are going to constitute this government to defend the rights of citizens. And that's literally what Thomas Jefferson wrote. But, don't take my word for it. Let's listen to, Thomas Jefferson himself. This is what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, right there. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So this is the entire point of the government, to defend the natural rights of its citizens. But it didn't do that, okay? Because going all the way back to the 17th century, colonial America built the institution of American slavery, purchasing enslaved Africans from Africa and transporting them to America, and then perpetuating slavery on their descendants. Now, slavery was justified by skin color and through the construction of the particular American version of racism. Racism was created to justify slavery. So slavery itself created this sort of particular American type of racism. And through this, Americans enslaved nearly a quarter of our own people. And we used racism as an excuse for the construction and perpetuation of slavery. And the American Revolution was supposed to get rid of all of this. All men are created equal. Yet we didn't do it, all right? After the American Revolution, the United States continued the practice of slavery, denying a quarter of Americans the natural rights that government was supposed to defend. And, why did they do this? And the answer is easy. It's money, all right? There was just too much money to be made with cotton, the cotton gin, slavery, and all of these things together built the American South. You can see it in the map right up above my head. Slavery built the American South. And the founding fathers knew this. They kind of knew that they were being massive hypocrites when they wrote these words, all men are created equal. But the founding fathers knew that they couldn't live up to their own goals. And the founding fathers intended for the goals of the United States to be aspirational, to be these idealized goals that could only be imperfectly realized. And they very much knew that they couldn't live up to their own ideals. Back then in the 18th century, they did the best they could. Frankly, just like we do today, we do the best we can. But the civil rights struggle, especially the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, came much closer to living up to these ideals of Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, these ideas that all men are created equal. They are given natural rights by their creator, and that government exists to secure these rights. The founding documents of the United States do not mention race. And the third thing we have to discuss, the third reason we have to discuss civil rights, the third reason all of this matters, is that these issues are still with us, all right? Just because institutional racism is illegal, just because Jim Crow is long dead, it doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist. These ugly ideas are, out there, all right? Is there systemic racism in America? Well, that's certainly debatable. It depends what you mean by systemic. But there are clearly individuals out there in the world, people in the nation that perpetuate racism and hold these really ugly racist ideas. There are clearly some people out there that wish to discriminate against others based on their race, based on their color, based on their national origin. And I'll give you a few examples of that. For instance, there's this practice called redlining. It's important because it's in all caps. Now, what is redlining? Redlining was a persistent feature in the big American cities, especially during the 1970s and 1980s. Now, redlining is when banks refuse to lend money for home loans to African American applicants. And I can pretty much tell you that every African American person of a certain age can tell you a different version of the same story. They're trying to borrow money to buy a house, and the loan officer is all grins and smiles until they look at where you want to buy this house. And suddenly their face falls and they go, oh, well, I have to talk to my bank manager about this. Oh, I'm very sorry, but we need additional review on this loan. We'll get back to you. And everybody knows it's all bullshit. Everybody knows that loan officer saw where you wanted to buy that house and killed your loan. And African Americans caught on to this very quickly when they realized that banks would approve mortgages in a traditional black neighborhood, but then they would consistently refuse to approve mortgages in a traditional white neighborhood. Homes on the other side of a invisible red line. That's why it's called redlining. Now, this unofficially maintained segregation in many American big cities, long after official segregation was illegal. And if you doubt me, look at those maps on the left. The map at the top is areas where the banks in Atlanta regularly lent money for home loans. And they didn't lend money in the dark areas of the map. And oh my goodness, if you look at that map on the bottom, it just so happens that those parts of Atlanta, those are the parts of Atlanta that high African American populations. Well, look at that. Isn't that a coincidence? That's a funny old world, ain't it? Now, redlining is quite illegal, all right, even though it's very, very difficult to prove. It's really hard to get a criminal conviction for redlining. And it's illegal largely as a result of a series of laws passed in the 1970s, particularly something called the Community Reinvestment Act, where the government requires that banks have to be able to demonstrate that there's no racial bias in their lending practices. But again, it's very, very hard to prove. And the statistics don't lie. The numbers don't lie. The rate of home ownership among African Americans is well below that of other groups. Now, and that's largely a result of these now illegal banking practices. And if you think, oh, that's something that happened in the 70s, in the 80s, you have to think about how mortgages actually work. I mean, it takes you about 30 years to pay off, a home mortgage. So an African American family that didn't get, a home mortgage in 1985 isn't paying off that home in 2015. All right. A mortgage that was denied to a family on the basis of race in 1990 meant that's a home that they don't own in 2020. So these practices continue through time. They have a long tail to them, and they still affect us today. Another example, the Civil Rights Act isn't just to protect African Americans, it is to protect all people. For example, about 20 years or so ago, Harvard University decided that too many Asian Americans were attending Harvard University. So they put an unofficial quota on how many students of Asian descent could actually go to Harvard University. And, over time, they figured this out real quick. And Harvard University is racially discriminating against students of Asian heritage. And right now, current year, Harvard University is going to the Supreme Court. It's being taken to court, to actually examine, are the racial preferences and the racial discrimination and the frankly ugly racism of Harvard University, will it be allowed to stand or not? And of course, this comes up to the present day. COVID slammed into the United States and the government started handing out COVID relief. And Joe Biden wanted to distribute the COVID relief along specifically racial lines, giving the relief specifically to African American communities and Asian American communities and Native American communities first. And this got a big slap down by the Supreme Court. You can't racially discriminate against any groups for any reason. And the Biden administration was like, well, we want to get the aid to these communities because they are the ones most negatively affected by COVID. And the Supreme Court says it doesn't matter. The government cannot discriminate against any group for any reason. And of course, we come down to the eternal and decades-long debate over voting suppression laws. Like, what laws constitute a suppression of the black vote? Are they trying to diminish the amount of voters who are voting for certain parties? And that argument and that debate has been going on ever since 1965, and it probably will go on all the way until 2065. It is a long, long discussion about basically what constitutes voter suppression. Now, all of this gets started. All of this originates all the way back in the 19th century. It all starts with the Civil War. And that's where we're going to start our story here, the Civil War. Now, from 1861 to 1865, 11 southern states seceded to form the Confederate States of America, a republic largely founded to defend the institution of American slavery. After 4 really long, bloody years of conflict, the South was militarily defeated and occupied, and large portions of the South were completely ruined and devastated by the military campaigns of the Civil War. And the ruination of the South was massive. Northern armies captured cities that had been reduced to complete rubble. Right there, that painting That is the Union Army occupying the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. The Northern armies left the countryside burned and ruined. As Sherman's army moved through Georgia, it destroyed every building that wasn't a church. 1/3 of the entire population of Southern men were killed in the Civil War, and at least equal that number left maimed and crippled for life. Key in the Union victory, key in the victory of the United States government, was the participation of African American soldiers. Large numbers of people escaped from the institution of slavery, made it north, and enlisted in the U.S. Army. Eventually, by the end of the war, black soldiers made up more than 10% of the entire military force of the United States. And these are Southern men. These Southern men charged south, displayed incredible amounts of bravery, and secured the Union victory because they were fighting for their civil rights and their freedom. Indeed, I would argue that the people who freed the slaves wasn't Abraham Lincoln, it wasn't the Republicans, that the slaves were ultimately freed by themselves, serving in the uniform of the American military. Now, after the Civil War, after this defeat, the South was divided into 5 military districts, each of these governed by a Northern general. And this is the period known as Reconstruction, all caps. Now, Reconstruction was a period in the 1860s and 1870s where the North attempted to militarily reconstruct the South, to convert it into a racially just society, and to defend the civil rights of the former American slaves. And you can see in that cartoon on the upper left, where you've got the African Americans on one side, the angry former Confederates on the other, and the American Army keeping the two groups separate. And the Army was, in particular, very sympathetic towards the freedmen. It was very sympathetic towards the former slaves because, again, those guys had signed up to fight. And it saw a lot of these former slaves as companions in arms, and largely saw the old white Confederates as a group of traitors and rebels. And we can see that in this cartoon right here, where a crippled white veteran greets a crippled African-American veteran with the caption, "A man knows a man." Now, as part of their readmission to the Union, the former Confederate states were required to ratify 3 new constitutional amendments. And these 3 amendments are collectively known as the Reconstruction Amendments. They're the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And here they are. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, outlaws slavery or any other form of indentured servitude. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, says that all citizens will receive equal treatment under the law. You can't discriminate based on race. And then you have the 15th Amendment that says all citizens have an equal right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that was passed in 1870. And collectively, those 3 amendments are the Reconstruction Amendments. With the Reconstruction Amendments, the government made distinct promises to African Americans that they would be treated fairly, that they would be allowed to vote, that they would be considered equal citizens in the American Republic. And African Americans began to exercise their votes in local elections, in federal elections. They elected black senators, black governors, black congressmen, black mayors, black councilmen. The 1870s saw a substantial number of African American leaders, 2 senators, 23 congressmen, and dozens of state representatives. And you can see the guys right up above me, the first black members of the U.S. Congress. And almost all of those guys were Republicans too. And this included prominently that guy on the left, PBS Pinchback, the first black governor of an American state. He was the governor of Louisiana. PBS Pinchback was a Civil War veteran, and he was the founder of the Louisiana Republican Party. And, for a few years there, for like this brief moment, I mean, it seemed that Reconstruction was actually working. It seemed that the country was actually becoming a racially just society following the terrible trauma of the Civil War. There was this brief window where it looked like it was gonna actually work. But that's not what happened. All right? It's not what happened at all. White Southerners, especially poor whites, blamed African Americans for the death and destruction of the Civil War. That is what happened to Columbia, South Carolina. The entire city was leveled. They blamed African Americans for the death and destruction and their maimed cousins and their dead husbands and, dead sons. White Southerners refused to accept the racial equality that was being imposed on them by the federal government, and they fought back. Former Confederates banded together into secret terror societies, with the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan. And these guys fought to reduce the civil rights of African Americans, specifically attacking their right to vote. They knew, these terror groups knew, that if they could destroy the right to vote, then they could go ahead and pass any kind of racist laws they wanted. And racial violence exploded across the South in the 1870s, kept in check only by the presence of the U.S. Army. That cartoon right up above me, that's not fooling. It was really only the Army that was keeping the peace in the South. Now, Southern leaders, all of whom were former Confederates, banded together and they became known as the Bourbon Democrats. And the Bourbon Democrats began to force a series of compromises with the federal government. They would basically say, okay, federal government, you've got to give us these things, or we're going to unleash the Klan and we're going to have horrible racial violence. So they began to force compromise with the federal government. The African Americans in the South and their Republican allies were just too few, too poor, and lacked strong, lasting support from the federal government. And then came the election of 1876. Nobody knows who won the election of 1876. It was two different candidates. The Republican candidate right up above me, Rutherford B. Hayes, and a Democratic candidate who didn't become president, so who cares what his name is. Now, in this disputed election of 1876, the Bourbon Democrats delivered the presidency to a deeply, deeply corrupt Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. And Rutherford B. Hayes became the president of the United States. And the deal the Bourbon Democrats made was this: they will betray their own Democratic candidate and switch 3 Southern states to Hayes. And in return for, becoming president, President Hayes would then pull the army out of the South and then follow a hands-off policy with the Southern states. Rutherford B. Hayes, one of the most corrupt presidents in American history, agreed. And this was this very sad moment called the Compromise of 1877. And Hayes did exactly what he said he would. He pulls the army out of the South, and he lets the South pass whatever kind of laws they want. And with the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction had failed. That brief window where it seemed that we were actually going to become a racially just society, that window slammed shut. Reconstruction began to fall apart all across the South. Without the army, African Americans and Southern Republicans were vulnerable to attacks from these secret terror organizations like the White League or the Klan itself. Many Republicans and African Americans saw in this compromise a betrayal of the dream of Abraham Lincoln, a betrayal of Lincoln's ideas, and a betrayal of the Civil War itself. You look at that cartoon on the upper left where a Klansman and a member of the White League shake hands, and their handshake becomes a skull. And beneath the skull, the newly enslaved African Americans of the South. And right up above me, that's a very salty cartoon right up above me. You have a crippled Union veteran being forced to shake hands with a swaggering Confederate whose boot is on the grave of a soldier, and the tombstone reads, "In memory of the Union heroes who died in a useless war." And Lady Liberty is crying over the grave of this hero who died in a useless war. And if you look over the shoulder of that swaggering Confederate, an African-American family is being dragged away in chains. And the American flag, torn, flies upside down. People were outraged at the Compromise of 1877, and they saw Rutherford Hayes betraying the idea of Abraham Lincoln. And some of the people that were extremely bitter at the federal government were Army officers, old Civil War generals, like this guy, General Oliver Otis Howard. Now, General Howard was the real deal. He was a Civil War veteran. He was a general for the North. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And if you'll note, he gave his arm for the cause. His right sleeve has no arm in it. And General Howard was really bitter towards the president. General Howard was, in fact, so bitter at Rutherford B. Hayes that he resigns his commission, and he basically puts all of his efforts into founding a new school, a school specifically designed to educate African-American students, because General Howard founds Howard University. And Howard University is, to this day, the premier historically Black university in the United States. I mean, one of the alumni of Howard University is that's Black Panther right there. That's Chadwick Boseman. By 1880, it was obvious that the Bourbon Democrats were now firmly in control of the South. Indeed, by the year 1880, of the 11 former Confederate states, 10 of them were either ruled directly by either a Confederate general or a former senior official of the Confederate government. The vice president of the Confederacy itself, Alexander Stephens, the dude is like the governor of Georgia in 1880. It's incredible. In any other nation, all of those guys on the left, all of those guys would have been shot at the end of the Civil War. But not in the United States. They all became leaders. They all became Bourbon Democrats. Hence, you have a lot of history on the Reconstruction itself, and history as to why Reconstruction failed. Because one of the things you can say about the end of the Civil War, about this incredibly messy end of the Civil War, is that the South might have lost the war, but they won the peace. And in the decades that followed, the South kind of became a country within a country, and state by state by state began to strip African Americans of their civil rights, starting with the right to vote. They instituted poll taxes, literacy requirements, grandfather clauses, and all of these things were unequally applied. I mean, if you look at that cartoon on the left, voters take literacy tests here, but somehow they would forget to administer the literacy test to white voters and then have an incredibly hard test for Black voters. You know, there was no secret ballot for most of the 19th century. So sometimes the African Americans would show up to vote just to find a gun pressed into the side of their head, making sure they voted for the right Democratic candidate. African American voting across the South collapsed. Now, the North was sympathetic, especially Northern Republicans, but they were overall basically powerless to oppose the South's drive to build this racially segregated society. After all, you know, the North was not going to fight the Civil War again. All right. And they were very sympathetic. You can see it in this cartoon where you've got the noble African-American man, and he's blocked from voting by, you know, Klansmen, white trash ruffians, gray-bearded old Confederate. And right behind that old Confederate, it says on the wall, the Constitution guarantees the Negro the right to vote, but what care we for the Constitution? Everybody knew that the civil rights were being ripped away from African Americans in the South, and the South is building this very ugly world that will be called Jim Crow. This was accompanied by a steady stream of racist propaganda designed by the Bourbon Democrats to convince the poor whites of the South that it was in their own best racial interest to support the collapse of civil rights across the South. I mean, look at that. The two platforms. The Democratic platform is for the white man. The Republican platform is for the Negro and the carpetbagger. And this stream of racist propaganda was largely successful. Southern Republicans trusted in the law to protect them. After all, they did have 3 constitutional amendments on their side, and chief among them is that fellow on the upper left, PBS Pinchback, the former governor of Louisiana. Now, Pinchback won an appointment to the U.S. Senate in 1872, but the Democratic-controlled Senate at the time refused to seat him. It refused to acknowledge that he was a senator from Louisiana. Now, Pinchback and his fellows decided to actually challenge the construction of Jim Crow. They decided to challenge the increasing segregation across the South. And they decided on a very, very small issue, which was the racial segregation of trains in Louisiana, which itself was a violation of the 14th Amendment. After all, trains were a public utility. They were harshly regulated by the federal government. And the federal government in the 14th Amendment says you can't segregate on the basis of race. So you can't have a white train and a black train. You can't have a car for white people and then a car for black people. They said, look, this is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. So what they decided is they picked this French Creole, and his name is Homer Plessy. And there's a very bad cartoon of him right up above my head. And they say, okay, he's going to get on a car, he's going to buy a first-class ticket, and he's going to sit in the whites-only section. He'll be arrested, and we'll take this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court must obviously see that this type of racial segregation is unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment. And this led to the very famous case of Plessy. This is Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896. And they lost. They lost. They couldn't believe it. The Supreme Court refused to defend the civil rights of African Americans. Jim Crow, the Supreme Court said, is completely constitutional, as the South is clearly capable of and legally able to make separate but equal accommodations for different racial categories. It was outrageous. And with Plessy versus Ferguson, the Bourbon Democrats now had all the legal authority they needed to go ahead and build the Jim Crow world, to build a fully segregated America. And that's exactly what they proceeded to do. And they were intensely proud of what they did. They were proud that they had built this ugly, segregated America. They were proud of the Jim Crow laws, and they celebrated what they had done. They celebrated that they had constructed the Jim Crow South. They celebrated the fact that they had created a segregated America. They celebrated it in parades. They celebrated it in monuments. They celebrated it in novels, like the one right up above my head. They even celebrated it in movies. You know, in the 1915 classic Birth of a Nation, which is both one of the most horrible and most fascinating movies ever made, where the Ku Klux Klan saves America. It's an absolutely horrific film. But there is help coming. It's not going to last forever. We will eventually find someone who will tear down this ugly thing they have built. And you're going to figure out how and why he was able to do it. But we're going to do that next time, and I will see you there.